When we first arrived at Shenandoah National Park, I remember thinking how peaceful it all was. The towering trees, the vast open skies, and the faint sound of birds singing in the distance. This was exactly the kind of break we all needed. I'm Alex, the planner of the group, and I'd organized this camping trip to get away from the stress of city life. Mark, my boyfriend, sat in the passenger seat beside me, relaxed and smiling as we made our way along the winding mountain road. Behind us in the RV were Jessica and Eric, my two closest friends. They weren't exactly the outdoorsy type, but they'd agreed to come along, maybe out of some sense of duty to reconnect. Eric was already cracking jokes about how bad he'd be at camping, while Jessica half laughed nervously, fiddling with her phone. I remember feeling so confident, so prepared. I'd planned everything, except, of course, for the things no one could plan for. We parked the RV at a small, secluded site off the Appalachian Trail, far from the more populated areas. That was the whole point. Isolation, serenity, nature at its purest. The weather was supposed to be clear all weekend, perfect for hiking and camping. As we started setting up camp, the first signs of trouble were small. Jessica complained about her shoes. "These hiking boots are killing me. Why did I even buy them?" she groaned. "They're probably just stiff," I said, brushing her off. I was already focused on getting the tent up, but that's when I noticed Mark shaking his head. "The tent's missing poles," he said, laughing a little. "We'll have to use the RV for tonight." "Fine," I replied, hiding my frustration. "Minor setbacks, nothing more." The real trouble began as dusk fell. It was subtle at first. As we sat around the small campfire Mark had built, the woods around us seemed to grow quieter. The bird song, once a pleasant background, faded into nothing. No wind stirred the leaves, and even the occasional sound of wildlife disappeared. I chalked it up to the natural rhythms of the forest, nocturnal creatures and all that. But then I noticed the smell. At first, it was faint, a whiff of something rotten, like spoiled meat. I thought maybe it was something in the air, or that something had died nearby. I didn't mention it, not wanting to freak anyone out. Eric, of course, was oblivious to the shift in mood. He was still joking around, telling some story about a horror movie he'd seen last week. "This place reminds me of one of those settings," he said, grinning as he poked at the fire. "A group of friends in the middle of nowhere, and then bam, haunted by some spirit or creature." "Shut up," Jessica muttered, hugging her knees. "This place is creepy enough already." I rolled my eyes at them both, but Mark shifted uneasily beside me, glancing out into the darkening woods. I was about to ask him what was wrong when he stood up suddenly. "Did you hear that?" he asked. "Hear what?" I said, feeling a flicker of irritation. We'd barely been here a few hours, and they were already on edge. "I swear I heard something," he said, his voice tense, like footsteps, heavy, coming from the woods. Eric laughed, but it was strained. "It's probably a bear or something, or maybe Bigfoot." Jessica looked pale, her eyes darting to the dark forest around us. "This isn't funny, guys." "It's nothing," I said firmly. "Just the woods settling down for the night. Let's not spook ourselves over nothing." But as the evening wore on, that smell of rot kept coming back, and so did the uneasy silence. Even the crackle of the fire felt muted. The next day was supposed to be better. We set out on the trail, hoping to shake off the weirdness of the night before. The weather was colder than expected, with a thick mist hanging low in the valley, making everything damp. Jessica slipped a few times on the muddy path, cursing under her breath. "This fog is so creepy," she muttered. Mark tried to lighten the mood. "It'll clear up once the sun's out. Let's just enjoy the hike." But I could tell he was uneasy too. None of us had slept well. Every time I drifted off, I thought I heard something moving outside the RV. Maybe it was my imagination, but something kept waking me up, like a low rustling or breathing. Halfway through the hike, we reached a lookout point. The fog had lifted just enough for us to see the rolling hills stretching out below us. I took a deep breath, feeling a sense of calm wash over me. Then I saw Mark, standing at the edge of the trees, staring into the distance. "Mark?" I called. He didn't answer. I walked over to him, a knot forming in my stomach. "What's wrong?" He pointed, his face pale. "Do you see that?" I squinted, looking where he was pointing. At first, I saw nothing but trees, but then something moved. A figure, tall and gaunt, barely visible through the mist. It stood completely still, as though it had been there the entire time, watching. "It's just a hiker," I said, though my voice sounded less confident than I'd hoped. "That's no hiker," Mark whispered. "Look at it." The figure stood too tall, its limbs too thin, and its skin seemed pale, almost translucent. But before I could get a better look, it was gone, melted into the fog. By the time we got back to the RV, the mood had soured. Mark was withdrawn, barely speaking, and Jessica kept glancing over her shoulder as though she expected something to jump out at us. The smell returned as we gathered around the campfire again that night. This time, it was stronger, more pungent, like decaying meat left out in the sun. Eric wrinkled his nose. "Okay, seriously, what is that?" "It's the woods," I said, though even I didn't believe it anymore. The silence pressed down on us like a weight, and then from deep in the trees we heard it, a voice, soft, distant, but unmistakably human. "Help me." We all froze. "What the hell?" Eric whispered, his eyes wide. The voice came again, a little closer. Help me." "It's someone in trouble," Mark said, standing up. "We need to go check." "No," I said, grabbing his arm. "We don't. That doesn't sound right." The voice was too calm, too controlled. There was no panic in it, no urgency. It sounded wrong, like it was echoing in the wrong direction. Jessica was shaking now, her face pale. "We have to leave. I don't like this." For once, Eric wasn't joking. "Yeah, maybe we should call it quits." But Mark was already moving toward the trees. "Mark, stop!" I hissed, following him. "This is crazy." He didn't stop. He kept walking toward the voice, his expression blank, as if he were in a trance. I reached out, grabbing him and pulling him back, just as a figure emerged from the fog, the same gaunt figure we'd seen earlier. It stood at the edge of the clearing, impossibly tall, its limbs too long, its eyes hollow black pits. My blood turned to ice. "What is that?" Jessica whispered, her voice trembling. The figure took a step forward, its body moving in a jerky, unnatural way, like it didn't know how to walk properly. Then, with a sickening crack, it twisted its head to the side, staring at us with those empty, soulless eyes. Mark stumbled back, snapping out of whatever trance had held him. We need to go now." The four of us rushed to the RV, slamming the door shut behind us. Outside, the figure circled the clearing, watching us, waiting. The next few hours were a blur of panic. We tried to start the RV, but the engine sputtered and died. The flashlight batteries drained within minutes. Every time we looked outside, the figure was there, standing at the edge of the trees, just watching. "We're trapped," Eric muttered, pacing the small space of the RV. "What the hell is that thing?" "It's not real," I said, though even I wasn't sure anymore. "It can't be." But it was, and it wasn't going anywhere. Mark sat in the corner, his head in his hands. "It's the Wendigo," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "What?" I asked, staring at him. "The Wendigo," he repeated. "It's an old Native American legend, a spirit of insatiable hunger. It drives people mad, makes them turn on each other." "That's ridiculous," I said, but my voice shook. "I've heard of it," Eric said, his face pale. "It feeds on fear and hunger." A cold realization washed over me, the constant hunger we'd all been feeling, the strange cravings, the paranoia. Everything had started the moment we'd arrived. "It's trying to drive us mad," Mark said, his eyes wild. "That's why it hasn't attacked. It wants us to destroy each other." By the time night fell, the Wendigo was closer, standing just outside the RV, its gaunt, twisted face pressed against the window, its fingers tapping softly on the glass. Jessica couldn't take it anymore. "I have to get out of here," she screamed, bolting for the door. "Wait," I shouted, but it was too late. She was already outside, running into the woods. We rushed after her, but the fog swallowed her whole. I could hear her screaming, her voice echoing through the trees, and then silence. We found her body a few minutes later. Her limbs were twisted, her face frozen in a mask of terror. The Wendigo stood over her, watching, its empty eyes locked on us. "We need to leave," Mark said, his voice shaking now. We stumbled back to the RV, but as we slammed the door shut, I saw the look in Mark's eyes. The hunger had taken hold of him. He was muttering to himself, his eyes darting toward me, then Eric. "He's not right," Eric whispered, "It's inside him." Mark lunged at me, his hands grasping at my throat. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice cracking. "I can't stop it." I struggled, pushing him off, and he collapsed to the floor, sobbing. Eric grabbed a metal pipe and stood over him, ready to strike if he tried again. "We have to get out of here," I said, my voice barely a whisper. The Wendigo was still outside, waiting. As we approached, the fog began to lift. We packed what little we could carry and made a run for it, leaving the RV behind. The Wendigo didn't follow. It just watched, its hollow eyes locked onto us as we disappeared down the trail. Even now, I can still feel its gaze, like it's always there, just beyond the edge of my vision. Watching. Waiting. I'll never go back to the wilderness again. Not after what I've seen. Not after what we've done. I came to Allegan National Forest to clear my head to shut out the noise and rebuild myself. I'd had it all planned. A long weekend of solitude in the Pennsylvania wilderness, alone with my thoughts and maybe enough bourbon to forget the mistakes I'd made back home. The kind of reset a guy sometimes needs after losing everything. Setting up camp went smoothly enough. My RV was nestled in a secluded pocket deep within the trees, and by sunset I was settling in, trying to forget that it had only been a week since my divorce was finalized. If anyone had asked, I would have said I was here to embrace the solitude, to challenge myself. But if I'm honest, I came to avoid feeling like I'd been left behind. The forest around me was quiet, almost too quiet. No hum of civilization, no faint rumbles of cars, just an unsettling silence broken only by the occasional bird call or the rustling of branches. But I told myself that's what I wanted, peace. On the first day, I'd spent hours hiking through the old-growth trails, letting the stillness absorb my thoughts. I met only one person, a guy named Randy, who I ran into as I turned a corner on a narrow trail. He looked about my age, tall with a scruffy beard and a wide grin that said he was more than happy to have company. "Not many folks come out this far," he said, giving me a nod. "A guy like you coming out here solo, just getting away from things?" I shrugged, not interested in diving into my personal life, but Randy's gaze stayed fixed on me, curious. "Well," he continued, "just be careful around these parts. Ever heard of the Hollow Men?" "The what?" I asked, laughing. This guy was clearly setting me up for some campfire story. "Spirits of miners," Randy explained, looking serious. "Died in a cave-in here back in the 1800s. They say they linger in these woods, hollow shells trying to lure folks to their doom. Even some of the locals won't come out here alone." He must have seen my skeptical look because he chuckled, adding, "Laugh all you want, man. Just don't go answering voices out there, all right?" I waved him off with a smirk, but his words stuck with me as I continued down the trail. The silence of the forest, once comforting, now felt watchful, like something was waiting just beyond the trees. That night, I sat by my RV staring up at the stars that looked almost unnatural in their brightness against the dark, empty sky. I poured myself a drink, willing myself to shake off Randy's ghost stories and just focus on the calm, on the stillness of the place. But the peace didn't come. Instead, there was a strange rhythmic sound echoing through the woods, like the distant tapping of metal against rock. It was faint, almost like an echo. My first thought was that it had to be some kind of old machinery, an oddity, but not impossible in a place like this. Still, it sent a chill through me, prickling the hairs on my arms. By the time I made it inside the RV, I was brushing off the noise as my imagination. But that's when I noticed something even stranger. My pocket knife was gone. It had been right there on the countertop where I'd left it after dinner, but now it was nowhere to be found. I checked my pockets, the table, even the floor, but it had vanished. I tried to shake off a growing sense of unease, telling myself I just misplaced it. But the feeling stayed with me, settling into my bones as I lay in bed that night, listening to the stillness around me. Just when I was on the verge of sleep, a quiet, subtle scratching sound echoed through the RV. My heart stopped as I lay frozen, straining to listen. Nothing. It was only the wind, I told myself. But that night, my dreams were filled with shadows shifting in the trees, voices whispering my name. The next day was more of the same. I explored deeper into the forest, and the unsettling feeling only grew stronger. I started hearing faint whispers just outside my line of sight, always when I was least expecting it. They were soft and quick, like a conversation I wasn't meant to hear or someone calling out, trying to get my attention. When I stopped to listen, though, they were gone. The worst was the fog. Sometime after midday, a strange, heavy fog rolled in, blanketing the forest in a dense gray haze. It felt like something out of a horror movie, obscuring the trails, making even familiar paths seem foreign and confusing. I tried to find my way back to camp, but every trail looked the same, winding and endless loops. By the time I finally stumbled into my campsite, I felt more disoriented than ever, as if I'd somehow crossed a boundary into a different world. That night, I heard it again, the rhythmic banging, louder this time, like the echoes of old mining tools. I sat in the RV clutching a flashlight, the noise reverberating through my mind until I couldn't stand it anymore. I had to know what was making that sound. The forest was alive in a way I'd never experienced before. Each shadow, each twist of a branch seeming to watch me, follow me. The sound led me deeper into the woods, my flashlight beam barely cutting through the thick fog that seemed to grow denser with every step. And then I saw them. Figures, barely visible through the haze. They were human shapes, no doubt about it, but hollow, like shadows cast against a wall. They moved in slow, shuffling steps. As I got closer, I realized they weren't walking. They were mining. Hands held picks that struck the ground rhythmically, echoing through the trees. "Hey!" I called out before I could think twice. Every head snapped up at once, a dozen hollow eyes turning toward me, empty and lifeless. My breath caught in my throat as I realized these weren't people. They weren't anything close to people. I stumbled backward, heart racing. The figures closed in as I turned to run. I heard a voice calling my name. Logan. Logan. It was Randy's voice, coming from somewhere beyond the shadows. I felt an instinctive pull, a need to answer him, to follow the voice. But I couldn't shake the memory of his warning. Don't go answering voices out there. I kept running, the voice following me, calling, pleading, until I was back at the RV. I slammed the door behind me, locking it, my breath coming in gasps as I stared out into the darkness. The hollow men lingered at the edge of the clearing, their eyes fixed on me, watching, waiting. I sat in the RV, every nerve on edge, wondering if they'd try to get inside. The silence was suffocating, broken only by the soft scrape of fingers or claws against the outside walls. Taking a deep breath, I forced myself to stop, to not resist, to not fight. I closed my eyes, hoping the hollow men would lose interest. Minutes ticked by agonizingly slow. Gradually, the sounds faded until finally, there was silence. I opened my eyes. The figures were gone. I started the RV and floored it, heart pounding as I sped away. I didn't stop until I reached a gas station outside Allegan, hands still shaking. I wasn't sure what I'd seen, but I knew one thing for certain. I wasn't going back. It had been 4 months since the divorce was finalized, and I was still trying to wrap my head around it. The life I had imagined, the woman I thought I would grow old with, it was all gone. That's why I decided to take the RV out to Mount Hood National Forest for a long weekend. I needed to get away from everything. No people, no reminders, just me and nature. My therapist said it would be good for me to clear my head and reconnect with something that didn't remind me of failure. Honestly, I didn't know if it would work, but I had to try something. If I stayed home, I would have just drowned myself in the silence of my empty apartment. This trip, I told myself, would be different. I could handle the quiet out here. I arrived in the late afternoon, pulling the RV into a spot near Timothy Lake. It was a beautiful area. Tall Douglas firs surrounded the lake like silent sentinels, the water reflecting the sky like a mirror. There were no other campers nearby, which was exactly what I wanted. Solitude. I parked, shut off the engine, and took a deep breath. The air was cool, crisp, with that faint scent of pine needles. Perfect. For a moment, I thought I could finally breathe again. After setting up a small campfire, I sat back in my foldable chair, staring at the fading light over the mountains. The only sound was the crackle of the fire and the occasional rustle of leaves in the breeze. Peace. That's what I needed. But as the sun dipped lower, the quiet became overwhelming. There was no wind now, no rustling, no animal sounds. Just me, sitting in a bubble of silence. I checked my watch. It was just after 6 p.m. That's when I noticed it. It was too quiet. The forest around me, which should have been alive with the sounds of birds and insects, was dead silent. At first, I figured it was just a lull, but as the minutes dragged on, the silence pressed down on me like a weight. I could hear the blood pumping in my ears, the soft crunch of every movement I made in my chair. It was like the whole forest was holding its breath. I shrugged it off. Maybe this was what true isolation felt like. No noise, no distractions, just me and my thoughts. But then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw movement between the trees. It was subtle, a shadow slipping between the trunks, just far enough away that I couldn't get a good look. I froze, squinting into the woods. The firelight flickered, casting long shadows that played tricks on my mind. I scanned the tree line, waiting for the shadow to return, but saw nothing. The trees stood still, their branches unmoving in the dead air. "Must be a deer," I muttered, forcing myself to relax. The wind picked up briefly, rustling the leaves. I sighed, relieved to hear some kind of noise again. I grabbed a few more logs and threw them onto the fire. The crackling wood was comforting, a reminder that I wasn't completely alone. I told myself I was just on edge from being out here, alone, with too much time to think. After eating a quick meal, I decided to call it an early night. The silence was getting under my skin, so I climbed into the RV, locked the door behind me, and settled into the small bed in the back. My phone had no signal, of course, but I wasn't planning on talking to anyone anyway. I lay there, staring at the ceiling, trying to let my mind go blank, but the silence didn't let me rest. The RV was soundproofed, but even then I felt like something was missing. No crickets, no owls, nothing, just the absence of sound. I felt trapped inside my own head. Every little shift of the mattress or rustle of my blanket amplified in the quiet. Eventually, I drifted off. Sometime in the middle of the night, I woke up with a start. I wasn't sure why at first. There hadn't been any loud noises or nightmares, just silence. But something was wrong. My skin prickled with unease. I sat up, rubbing my eyes, and glanced around the RV. The windows were fogged up, and the air felt heavier, somehow oppressive. I heard something outside. No, that wasn't right. I heard nothing outside. I swung my legs out of bed and stood, listening closely. It was the strangest sensation, like my own breathing was distant, muffled, as though I wasn't entirely in my own body. I moved toward the window and wiped away some of the condensation with my sleeve, peering into the blackness beyond the RV. For a long time, I saw nothing, just trees and shadows, and then movement. This time, I was sure. A figure stood at the edge of the clearing, just barely visible in the moonlight. Tall, unnaturally still, like it was waiting for something. My heart leapt into my throat as I strained to see more clearly. It didn't move, just stood there watching. "Hello?" I called, my voice shaky. The figure didn't respond. I backed away from the window, heart pounding, my mind racing. Was it another camper? Some kind of ranger? No, there was no way anyone would be out here this late without a sound. I checked the door. It was still locked. Good. But I felt exposed, vulnerable, knowing that whatever was out there was watching me. I grabbed the flashlight and shined it out the window, sweeping the beam across the clearing. The figure was gone. Just like that. Vanished. As if it had never been there. The next morning, the forest was still eerily quiet. No birds, no animals, just the constant oppressive silence. I tried to shake off the unease from the night before, but it clung to me like a wet blanket. I told myself I was just paranoid, that the solitude was messing with my head, but something about the way the air felt today. Something was off. I decided to take a short hike to clear my mind, hoping that getting out of the RV would make me feel better. But as I ventured down the trail, that feeling of being watched grew stronger. Every few minutes, I'd glance over my shoulder, expecting to see someone or something behind me, but the trail was empty. That's when I saw it again, a figure, this time in the distance, standing between the trees just off the trail. It was the same one from last night, tall, gaunt, and still. My heart hammered in my chest as I squinted, trying to make out more details. But before I could move, it slipped behind the trees and disappeared. I ran toward the spot where I'd seen it, my boots pounding against the damp earth. When I reached the trees, there was nothing. No footprints, no broken branches, nothing to show that anyone had been there at all. I stood there, catching my breath, feeling the silence pressing down on me like a vice. That's when I noticed something strange. The forest around me was completely still. Even my footsteps had stopped making noise. I stopped my boot on the ground, but I heard nothing, not even the crunch of leaves beneath my feet. Panic surged through me. I clapped my hands together. Nothing. No sound. My breathing was shallow, frantic, but it was like I was listening to it from far away. The world had gone completely, impossibly silent. And then I saw them. Not just one figure, but several, moving between the trees. Their bodies blended with the shadows. They were everywhere, circling me in complete silence. My heart raced, but I couldn't hear it. I couldn't hear anything. I ran. I didn't know where I was going, just that I needed to get away. My legs felt heavy, every step muted, like I was running underwater. The forest shifted around me, the trail disappearing into the thick fog that had rolled in, disorienting me further. Somehow I made it back to the RV. I slammed the door shut, locking it, my breath coming in ragged gasps, but still no sound. I grabbed my phone, hoping to call for help, but it was useless. The screen flickered, the GPS spinning in circles. I was trapped. For the next few hours, I stayed inside the RV, pacing back and forth, trying to calm myself down, but the silence never lifted. I couldn't even hear my own thoughts anymore. Just the crushing weight of nothingness. And then, as the light began to fade, I saw them again, the silent ones. They were standing in a circle around the RV, their faces blank, their eyes hollow. There were no features, no mouths, just smooth skin where their faces should have been. They stood perfectly still, watching me through the windows, their bodies unnervingly thin and elongated. I banged on the window, screaming, but of course, no sound came. They didn't flinch, didn't move. They just stared, waiting. Desperation clawed at me. I couldn't stay here. I needed to leave, but the RV wouldn't start. Every time I tried, the engine sputtered and died, as if something was draining the life out of it. I grabbed a flashlight and opened the door, stepping outside. The silent ones didn't move, didn't react. But as I walked toward them, the air grew colder, the silence even more oppressive. My footsteps made no sound. My breathing was barely there. I felt a hand on my shoulder and spun around, expecting to see one of them behind me. But there was nothing, just the fog swirling around me and the figures waiting in the distance. In that moment, I realized what they wanted. They weren't going to kill me. No, that would be too simple. They wanted me to join them, to become one of them. The silence wasn't just the absence of sound, it was a part of them, and it was seeping into me, stealing my voice, my thoughts, my very sense of self. And if I stayed here much longer, I knew I would lose everything. I don't remember how I made it out. The next thing I knew, I was driving far away from the campsite, from the silent ones. The sound of the engine, the tires on the road, it was all faint, like I was still caught in their grip. But at least there was something, a reminder that I hadn't completely disappeared into that silence. It's been weeks since I got back, but I can still feel it. The quiet follows me, lingers in the corners of my apartment. Sometimes, when I'm lying in bed at night, I can feel their eyes on me, watching, waiting. And I know that one day, they'll come for me again. This time, I won't be able to run. I needed this escape after the year I'd had. Peace was the only thing I craved. My ex-wife had taken the house, my boss had taken my sanity, and I was left holding nothing but a bag of resentment and a camera. So here I was, finally alone in Black Rock Canyon, Joshua Tree's hauntingly beautiful desert. They said these nights were the darkest in the country, perfect for the long exposure shots I needed for my portfolio, but also hopefully for some much-needed clarity. The sky was ink black, spattered with a smattering of stars, and my RV felt like a fragile shell in this immense desert, which stretched out infinitely on all sides. I set up my tripod, thinking how strange it was to have so much space and yet feel the weight of something closing in, pressing down on me from every angle. I framed the shot, the rock formations jagged against the horizon like bones clawing up from beneath the desert. Just as I clicked the shutter, something caught my eye. Something odd up on a nearby ridge. A pile of stones stacked in a rough tower stood silhouetted against the fading light. I squinted, unease prickling the back of my neck. It wasn't a cairn, at least not like the ones I'd seen before. These rocks were stacked too high and too precisely, almost ritualistic in their placement. And yet I'd seen no one here, not a soul for miles. I shook it off and went back to shooting. The night, with all its dark expansiveness, was settling in, and I was ready to forget everything. That's when I heard it, a low humming sound reverberating through the thin air. It was faint, just a vibration, but I felt it in my bones. I stood still, listening, straining my ears as it grew louder, rhythmic, almost like a chant. I whipped around, expecting to find some desert animal or even another hiker, but there was nothing. Just the stacked stones up on the ridge, now looming in the moonlight, their shadows long and spindly like fingers stretching down toward me. "All right," I muttered, forcing a laugh. "Maybe you're just getting a little too comfortable out here." I forced myself back into the RV, telling myself it was just the wind, a desert echo, a trick of the open space. But that hum stuck with me, burrowing into my chest like a thorn I couldn't shake. I didn't think much more of it until the middle of the night when I was jolted awake by a noise inside the RV, a clicking, snapping sound. My heart hammered as I sat up, listening. Nothing. I climbed out of bed, checking the windows, and noticed my camera's light blinked. That's when I saw them. The pictures. They'd been taken while I was sleeping. Distorted, blurry images of me lying in bed, the RV's dim interior barely illuminated. What the? I muttered, flipping through them, my mind scrambling for an explanation. There was no way I'd taken these. The only other option was that someone had been in here while I was asleep. My pulse raced, and I checked the door, feeling a wave of relief to find it locked. I told myself the camera was just malfunctioning, a faulty shutter, maybe. But still, the hairs on my arms stood on end. In every photo, just beyond the frame, there was a shadow, a faint blur, like someone was standing just out of sight. I glanced out the window, half expecting to see someone staring back at me. But there was nothing, just the desert, empty and still. Reluctantly, I climbed back into bed, but sleep was out of the question. Every creak of the RV felt amplified in the silence, and I lay awake until the first light of dawn finally broke the tension. In the harsh light of morning, my nerves felt foolish. Determined to shake the feeling, I threw on my gear and hiked up to the ridge where I'd seen the stacked stones. The desert had that strange, quiet hum again, as if it were alive and breathing. The closer I got, the more stones I saw. They were everywhere, scattered across the sand, piled high, some forming a rough circle. At the center, I found something I hadn't expected, a rusted metal plaque, half buried in the dirt, worn down but legible. I brushed the sand off, reading the words aloud, feeling the weight of each one. "Do not disturb the desert's watchful ones." I swallowed, feeling an odd chill run through me. I'd read enough stories, heard enough lore, to know that some things were better left alone. I made my way back to the RV, but that feeling of being watched clung to me. I was only a few feet from the door when I saw it. Someone standing at the edge of the rocks, staring down at me. My heart skipped. I called out, "Hello?" But there was no answer. They just stood there, perfectly still, a tall figure with shadowed features. I blinked, and they were gone. That night, I set up my camera again, trying to capture the stars, hoping to drown out the unease and work. But as the hours passed, the desert seemed to close in around me, and the silence grew almost deafening. Around midnight, the humming started again, that same low drone, a chant. I shut my eyes, telling myself it was a desert sound, a trick of the wind. But when I opened my eyes, something shifted at the edge of my vision. There it was again, that shadowy figure. This time, closer, standing just beyond the reach of my headlights. Its features were obscured but unmistakably human. I couldn't see its face, but I felt its eyes on me, cold and unblinking. "Who are you?" I shouted. But it said nothing. It just stood there, silent, watching. I felt the chill seep into my bones as the figure slowly lifted a hand, pointing toward the ridge and the circle of stones. My mind screamed at me to stay in the RV, to lock the doors and wait for morning. But something inside me pushed back. A bitter voice whispering that I was here to face my demons, even if they were made of nothing more than shadow and sand. I stepped out of the RV, heart pounding, and aimed my flashlight toward the figure. But the light revealed nothing. The figure was gone. My camera, though, my camera kept snapping on its own, capturing photo after photo. I checked the screen, flipping through them with growing horror. The pictures showed me standing in front of the RV, but behind me there was someone, a figure standing in the shadows, grinning. Its face half-formed, almost human but twisted, as if made from sand and shadows. I stumbled back, fighting the instinct to run, and nearly tripped over the piled stones near the ridge. My breath was ragged, and I felt something cold brush against my neck. A whisper, low and distorted, echoing in the emptiness. "Ethan," it hissed. I snapped. I hurled my camera toward the stones, smashing it on the rocks, hearing it shatter into pieces. I don't know why I did it, but something told me that's what it wanted, that whatever this thing was, it had fed off my memories, my photos, my presence. The desert was silent again. I felt it let go of me, the weight easing, and I staggered back to the RV, trembling, feeling a strange sense of loss and relief. I drove all night, the desert a blur of shadows in my rearview mirror, refusing to look back. But as dawn broke, I felt a strange calm settle over me, a peace I hadn't felt in years. I didn't know what I'd seen, but I knew it was gone, left behind with the shattered pieces of my camera and whatever had haunted me for so long. Weeks later, I found a package in the mail. No return address, no note. Just a simple envelope. Inside was a single photo. It was one of my last shots from Black Rock Canyon, a photo of me asleep in the RV, peaceful, unaware. But in the corner of the image, a shadow hovered over me, its hand reaching out, as if trying to pull something out of me. And there, scrawled across the back of the photo, were 5 chilling words. "You will come back someday." The forest was supposed to be my escape. I drove the RV deep into the Blue Ridge Mountains, hoping the solitude would offer some kind of peace. I had been out here a few times before, never this deep though, but it had always been calming. Nature had a way of quieting the noise in my head. After I left the job, the silence became my companion, even though it haunted me with memories I wasn't ready to face. The accident that had ended my career as a paramedic. Every night, it replayed in my mind, always the same horrific details. But with each viewing, I saw a new way I could have saved the child. A different decision, a split second sooner. And maybe it didn't matter. I was here now, alone. The sound of the gravel crunched under my tires as I parked off an old dirt road. It was oddly satisfying. I turned off the engine, and for a moment there was bliss. No noise except for the rustle of trees in the wind. This was what I needed. No sirens, no screaming, just the mountains. I grabbed my bag and climbed out, stretching my legs before heading over to the old fire lookout tower nearby. It was a relic, long abandoned and forgotten by most hikers. The wood was graying, peeling away from years of exposure, but it stood firm, a silent sentinel watching over the rolling hills. Something about the place had always intrigued me. It had a gravity to it, like it was holding secrets that only those who ventured close enough could learn. I planned to spend the weekend here, at least 3 days before I had to go back to reality. I didn't need much, just the stillness, the mountains, and a break from the memories. I set up camp near the RV, built a small fire, and tried to let go. But the quiet was different this time. The first night, it started with whispers. I was sitting by the fire, watching the flames flicker against the trees, when I thought I heard voices, not nearby, but carried on the wind. Faint, like a conversation just out of reach. I strained to listen, but they faded, lost in the rustle of the leaves. Probably just my mind playing tricks, I told myself. I hadn't slept well in weeks, and the quiet, while peaceful, was unnerving in its own way. After a while, I retreated to the RV, exhausted, but the voices lingered in the back of my mind, soft murmurs that tugged at my thoughts. As I lay down, I told myself it was nothing, just echoes of people who had camped here long before. The wind could carry sounds in strange ways out here, but the deeper I fell into sleep, the louder they grew, until I jerked awake, covered in sweat. There were no voices, just the oppressive weight of silence. I stared at the ceiling, the same question running through my mind. Was this peace or something else? The next morning, things started to get strange. I woke to find my watch blinking, frozen at 2:47 a.m. I tapped the screen a few times, but it refused to budge. Strange. When I checked my phone, it was dead, despite being fully charged the night before. I chalked it up to bad luck, but when I stepped out of the RV, the sun seemed higher in the sky than it should have been. It was late morning, but it felt like I had only just fallen asleep. I spent the day hiking, keeping my mind occupied. The trail was familiar. I'd hiked this ridge before, but something about it felt different. Landmarks I swore I'd seen on the way up seemed out of place, or worse, missing. And every time I thought I was making progress, I'd find myself right back where I started. The same twisted tree, the same rock formation. A loop. The disorientation didn't set in all at once. It was a slow, creeping unease that settled in my bones. The wind felt wrong too, as if it was carrying something. I couldn't quite hear those whispers again. Faint, distorted, carried on the breeze. This time, they were closer. By nightfall, the voices were louder. They weren't whispers anymore, but full conversations, disembodied words spoken in tones I couldn't place. It was like someone was just out of view, talking, laughing. At first, I stayed by the fire, trying to block it out, but the longer I sat there, the clearer the voices became. I couldn't make out what they were saying, but it was as if they were replaying over and over, fragments of words lost on the wind. I stood up, scanning the tree line. Shadows flickered just beyond the light of the fire. My breath caught in my throat. "Hello?" I called, my voice cracking in the stillness. No answer. The hairs on my neck stood up as I watched the shadows shift. A figure. It moved between the trees, far enough that I couldn't see clearly, but close enough to make my pulse quicken. My first thought was that it was another hiker, maybe someone lost. But when I took a step toward it, it vanished, gone, as if it had never been there. I grabbed my flashlight, pointing it into the woods, but the beam of light revealed nothing but trees. I tried to convince myself it was just my mind playing tricks again, but my gut told me otherwise. There was something here, something I didn't understand. I retreated to the RV, locking the door behind me. But even inside, the silence was heavy. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, listening. The voices were still there, faint now, but constant. It felt like someone was standing just outside the RV, talking in circles, over and over. The next morning, I hiked to the old fire lookout. I don't know why. Something about the tower drew me in, like I needed to be there. It was old, dilapidated, and crumbling, but it held a strange power. When I reached the top, I could see for miles. The Blue Ridge Mountains stretched out in every direction, green and endless. I expected to feel some sense of peace, but instead, a deep dread settled in my chest. The lookout wasn't empty. It was filled with the remnants of people who had come here before me. Old camping gear, torn sleeping bags, cans of food long since expired, graffiti scratched into the wooden beams, names etched into the walls. And something else, carved into the center of the floor, was a symbol. A crude spiral, looping in on itself. I knelt down, running my fingers over the grooves. It looked old, weathered, like it had been there forever. The voices returned, this time louder, clearer. I whipped around, expecting to see someone standing behind me, but the tower was empty, just the wind whistling through the cracks in the wood. I ran my hands through my hair, my heart pounding in my chest. Something was very wrong here. The ridge, the lookout. It wasn't just an old campsite. It was a trap, a loop, and I was stuck in it. I tried to leave that afternoon, packed up the RV, started the engine, and drove down the winding road that had brought me here. But no matter how far I drove, the landscape didn't change. The trees, the rocks, it all blurred together. The same stretches of road repeating over and over. After what felt like hours, I found myself back at the campsite, the fire now cold and dead, sitting in the exact same spot. My heart sank. I tried again. This time, I took a different route. But once again, the RV looped back to the same spot. It was as if the mountain wouldn't let me leave. By nightfall, I knew the truth. The whispers weren't random. They weren't in my head. They were echoes. Echoes of the past, of people who had been here before me, people who had tried to leave and failed. I sat in the RV, staring out the window at the darkening woods. The figures had returned. This time, there were more of them. They moved between the trees, watching me, waiting. One by one, they stepped into the clearing, surrounding the RV. I could see them now, faded, distorted, like shadows of people long gone. Their faces were blank, their movements slow and deliberate. They said nothing, but I could hear them. Their voices, the same words looping over and over. I backed away from the window, my hands shaking. This was it. I was stuck. Trapped in their endless loop, just like they were. The door creaked open. I don't remember what happened next, only that I woke up the next morning, sitting by the cold, dead fire. The RV door was wide open. The woods, empty and still. But the whispers were gone. For now. I don't know how long I've been here. Days? Weeks? Time doesn't seem to work the same way anymore. Every time I think I'm getting closer to an answer, I find myself right back where I started. I'm not alone on this ridge. There are others. I can hear them sometimes, their voices echoing. If you'd told me a week ago that I'd be clutching my best friend's arm, hiding from a shadow creature in the Utah desert, I'd have laughed. That's the sort of stuff reserved for ghost stories told around the campfire, right? But now, as I crouch low in the sand, staring at the shadow shifting through the rocks like smoke, the chill in my spine tells me I was wrong. Tyler and I had been planning this trip for ages. It was supposed to be a break from our relentless lives back in San Francisco. When my promotion came through, I convinced him we had to celebrate by camping across the Southwest, ticking off bucket list spots along the way. Dead Horse Point was the prize, the place I'd looked forward to the most. Its isolation, haunting beauty, and honestly, its reputation for eerie legends that I couldn't resist. We pulled in late, just as the sun was setting over the canyon, casting a blood-red glow across the twisted rock formations. I remember that unease settled over me then, the kind that sends a tiny shiver from the back of your neck all the way down. Tyler, ever the skeptic, brushed it off as I pointed out that we were alone in this remote part of the park. "Great, more room for us," he joked, snapping photos of the stunning desert horizon. It took us a bit longer to find a spot than we'd planned. Our GPS was acting weird, leading us down dirt trails that seemed to spiral into nowhere. Eventually, Tyler managed to maneuver our RV into a flat area. Not ideal, but secluded and scenic. "Perfect," he said. I wasn't so sure. When we finally set up camp, the daylight had faded, leaving us bathed in the cold blue of twilight. I fiddled with our old portable radio, hoping to get some music to fill the silence, but the thing just crackled with static before sputtering and dying altogether. Tyler laughed, but I caught the way his eyes darted around the empty landscape. It felt almost oppressive, the way the land seemed to watch us. "You and that ghost-loving imagination," Tyler teased, rummaging through his bag. "Maybe it's a sign, or just Utah's finest weather." "Ha, very funny," I replied, forcing a laugh. "But this place has stories, Ty. Have you heard of the Skinwalker?" "The what?" he chuckled, turning to face me. "Mia, are you seriously bringing up ghost stories?" "Not ghosts, exactly," I said, trying to hide how uneasy I felt. Skinwalkers are shapeshifters in Navajo legends. They can mimic people, even voices, to lure you away. People say they're evil spirits in human or animal form. Tyler looked at me with that familiar, infuriating smirk. "Oh yeah? Then let's summon one here. Skinwalker, Skinwalker, show yourself!" I hissed for him to stop, but he just laughed and returned to the viewfinder on his camera, snapping photos of the canyon now fully cloaked in darkness. I closed the RV door, hoping to shut out the chill that had suddenly settled into my bones, but that shiver, that sense of being watched, it lingered. It was maybe an hour later when the first sound came, a light shuffling sound outside, like footsteps in the gravel. My heart skipped and I shot Tyler a look, but he was already putting on a brave face, pulling his boots on to investigate. "It's probably an animal," he whispered, winking. "Mountain lions, right?" "Yeah, because mountain lions sound like people," I said, my voice barely a breath. He ignored me, clicking on his flashlight and stepping out. It was quiet, eerily so. Tyler scanned the flashlight across the rocks. The beam cast long shadows. For a moment, I was almost convinced he was right, that we were just being paranoid in the strange silence of the desert. But then we heard it, a whisper. It was faint but unmistakable. "Mia! Mia!" My breath caught in my throat. The voice was scratchy and low, calling my name. I whipped around to face Tyler, but he was frozen, his face drained of color as the voice echoed again. "Did you?" I stammered, trying to find the words. Tyler didn't answer. He just stared, flashlight clutched so tightly his knuckles were white. "Mia, Mia." This time the voice seemed closer, as if it were slipping between the rocks, winding its way through the desert toward us. It sounded familiar too. Too familiar, but wrong. "Let's go inside," I whispered. Tyler nodded, and we backed up slowly, not turning our backs on the emptiness around us. Once inside, I locked the door. Our breaths were rapid in the tight space. Tyler finally spoke, his voice shaking. "Tell me that was just the wind." "I don't think so," I replied, glancing out the window. The night was still, an unnatural stillness that seemed to hold its breath. Just as I was starting to feel a little less tense, there was a sharp knock on the side of the RV. We both froze. Another knock, then another, rhythmic, echoing through the metal walls. Tyler's face paled, and I could feel my heartbeat hammering in my throat. "Who's there?" he called, his voice wavering. The only answer was a slow scrape against the door, a sound that made my skin crawl. I squeezed Tyler's arm. "Don't open it." "What if someone's hurt?" he whispered back, already inching toward the door. But I couldn't shake the feeling that opening that door would be the worst thing we could do. "Just wait." Then, to our horror, we heard it, Tyler's voice calling from outside. "Tyler, help! Come out here!" Tyler looked at me, eyes wide with terror. "What? How?" he stammered. The voice repeated, distorted, stretching his name into a twisted mockery. "Tyler, Tyler." I grabbed his hand, squeezing hard. "Don't answer. Whatever you do, don't answer it." "Telling me she's a ghost?" Ellie shrugged. "Call it what you want, but she's real, and now that you've seen her, she won't let you go." I laughed, though it came out shaky. "That's insane." "Is it?" Ellie asked, her gaze locking onto mine. "You saw her. You know she's real." I opened my mouth to argue, but the words died in my throat. I had seen her, and it hadn't been a trick of the light or my imagination. Something had been there, something that shouldn't have been. "What does she want?" I asked quietly. Ellie's eyes flicked toward the lake. She wants what she's always wanted, to take someone with her into the water. That night, the sound started again. At first, it was the soft humming, drifting through the night air. Then the splashing, gentle, rhythmic, like someone wading through the water. I lay in bed, my heart racing, my body tense. I didn't want to go outside. I didn't want to see her again. But the pull was stronger this time. A strange compulsion tugged at me, drawing me toward the lake. I tried to fight it, to stay in the RV, but my legs moved on their own, carrying me outside into the cold night air. The lake was calm, reflecting the pale moonlight. And there she was, standing in the water, her white dress billowing around her as if moved by an unseen current. "Come to me," she whispered, her voice soft but clear. "Please come." I took a step forward, my body moving against my will. The water lapped at my shoes, and I could feel the cold seeping into my skin. "Come with me," she said again, her voice almost pleading now. "I've waited so long." I fought to resist, to break free from whatever force was drawing me in. But my feet kept moving, the water now up to my knees, freezing cold. I could feel the pull of the lake, the weight of the water dragging me down. Suddenly, A hand grabbed my arm, yanking me back with such force that I stumbled onto the shore. Ellie stood beside me, her face pale, her grip strong. "You have to leave," she said, her voice urgent now. "Before it's too late." I looked back at the lake, but the woman was gone. The water was still, as if nothing had happened. "What the hell is happening?" I gasped, my breath coming in shallow bursts. Ellie's expression was grim. "She's marked you now. If you stay, she'll take you. You have to go." I didn't argue. I packed up my things, my hands shaking, adrenaline coursing through my veins. Within minutes, I was back in the RV, starting the engine and pulling out of the campsite as fast as I could. As I drove away, I glanced in the rearview mirror. Ellie stood at the edge of the grove, watching me go, her face unreadable. And behind her, just barely visible in the mist, was the Lady of Stillwater, her pale eyes following me, waiting for me to return. I didn't look back again. "Utah's finest weather." "Ha, very funny," I replied, forcing a laugh. "But this place has stories, Ty. Have you heard of the Skinwalker?" "The what?" he chuckled, turning to face me. "Mia, are you seriously bringing up ghost stories?" "Not ghosts, exactly," I said, trying to hide how uneasy I felt. "Skinwalkers are shapeshifters in Navajo legends. They can mimic people, even voices, to lure you away. People say they're evil spirits in human or animal form." Tyler looked at me with that familiar, infuriating smirk. "Oh, yeah." I've always loved the quiet. That's the real reason I camp alone and hike alone. It's not about proving anything to anyone. It's about the silence. The kind of silence that presses against you like a weight, smoothing out the chaos of everyday life. Out here, far from deadlines and the blaring traffic, I can hear my own thoughts. But it's a fragile thing, the peace that the wilderness offers. I've learned that the quiet can also play tricks on you, turn on you. That's what happened to me in the San Juan National Forest. I'd been camping alone plenty of times before, but this trip was different. I still have trouble putting it into words. All I know is that the silence stopped being my friend somewhere on the second day. I'd planned to be out there for 4 days, just long enough to clear my head and reset. The spot I'd picked was remote, a stretch of dense forest near Pagosa Springs that even the locals didn't visit often. It was perfect, or so I thought. The first day went like it always does. The drive up was uneventful, and after a few hours of hiking, I found the perfect campsite. It was tucked away by a creek, surrounded by towering pines, with a small clearing just big enough for my tent and fire pit. I felt that familiar rush of excitement as I set up camp. The freedom of being out here completely alone, with nothing but wilderness around me. That first night was easy. I sat by the fire, listening to the water rush over the rocks in the creek. I wrote in my journal a bit, mostly just notes about the hike and some thoughts about work. Then I crawled into my tent, ready to sleep. The silence was comforting at first, as it always is, but I woke up in the middle of the night to something strange. It was subtle, just a faint whispering sound, like the wind picking up through the trees. I brushed it off, telling myself it was nothing, and eventually drifted back to sleep. The next day, things started to go wrong. I woke up later than I'd planned, the sky already a pale blue overhead. My stove was acting up, which was weird because it had worked fine the night before. It just wouldn't light, no matter what I tried. I ended up eating cold granola and packing up my camp, ready to move deeper into the forest. That's when I noticed my GPS wasn't working. I'd had reception when I camped here before, but now my phone was useless. No signal at all. I wasn't worried yet, though. I'd brought a map, and I knew the area well enough to navigate without technology. Still, the feeling that something wasn't right settled in, and I couldn't shake it. The hike was harder than I expected. My legs felt heavier, like the air itself was weighing me down, and the forest was quiet, too quiet. Normally, you'd hear birds or the occasional rustle of squirrels in the underbrush, but today, it was just still. The silence felt unnatural. I found another campsite by late afternoon, a little further into the woods next to a meadow that looked untouched. I set up my tent quickly, eager to get a fire going, But as I worked, the feeling of being watched crept up on me. I couldn't shake it. Every time I glanced over my shoulder, nothing was there. Just trees and shadows, but the sensation wouldn't leave. That night, I heard the whispers again. This time, they were louder, clearer, and they weren't random. They were saying something, my name. I sat up in my tent, my heart pounding. The sound was faint but unmistakable, drifting on the breeze from somewhere just beyond the clearing. I grabbed my flashlight, unzipped the tent, and shone the light into the trees. Nothing. The forest was still, the fire flickering in the corner of my vision. I stood there for a long time, listening, but the whispering had stopped. It was just the wind. It had to be. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. By the third day, I was exhausted. I hadn't slept much the night before, and the feeling of unease had only grown stronger. My gear wasn't cooperating either. When I tried to pack up my tent, I found that the poles had bent. They were new, barely used, but somehow they were warped, like something had twisted them while I slept. It didn't make sense. The whispering was back too, even during the day. It followed me as I hiked, a faint sound on the edge of hearing, like someone walking just out of sight. I kept telling myself it was the wind, but deep down, I knew something wasn't right. I wasn't alone out here. Then there was the whistling. It started around midday, just after I'd set up my third camp. At first, I thought it was a bird, but the sound was too deliberate, too human. It came from somewhere deep in the woods, a high, clear note that echoed through the trees. I froze, listening. The sound grew louder, closer, then stopped as suddenly as it had begun. I called out, hoping it was another hiker, someone who'd stumbled across my camp, but there was no response, just silence. I tried to stay calm, but the sense of being watched was overwhelming. Now it felt like something was circling me, just beyond my vision, waiting. That night, the whispers didn't stop. I lay in my tent, wide awake, listening as the sound of my name drifted through the trees. It was faint at first, like it had been the night before, but as the hours passed, it grew louder, more insistent. Dylan. I grabbed my flashlight and stepped outside, the cold night air biting at my skin. The fire had died down, casting long, flickering shadows across the clearing. I scanned the trees, heart racing, but there was nothing, just darkness. I was about to crawl back into my tent when I saw something move, a shadow slipping between the trees. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. It was too big to be an animal, and it was moving too deliberately, like it was watching me, waiting. I turned off my flashlight and backed into the tent, my mind racing. I'd never been this scared in the woods before, not once in all the years I'd camped alone. But now there was something out there. I could feel it. I zipped the tent shut and tried to calm my breathing, but the whispers were inside my head now. They weren't just outside, they were all around me. Dylan. I didn't sleep at all that night. I sat in my tent, clutching the flashlight, listening as the whispers circled me. Sometimes it sounded like one voice, sometimes several, but it was always the same soft, insistent calling my name. By dawn, I couldn't take it anymore. I packed up my gear as quickly as I could, my hands shaking. I didn't care where I was going anymore. I just needed to get out of these woods. But as I started hiking, the whistling began again. This time, it was closer, following me like something was walking just behind me, whistling a slow, eerie tune. I didn't stop to look. I didn't want to see whatever it was. I just kept walking, faster and faster, until I was practically running down the trail. But then I heard it, the unmistakable sound of footsteps behind me. I froze, heart pounding in my chest, and slowly turned around. There, standing just at the edge of the clearing, was a figure. It was tall and thin, its skin pale and stretched tight over its bones. Its eyes were hollow, and its lips were curled into a grin. It stood there, staring at me, its head cocked to the side as if amused. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. The whistling had stopped, and now there was only silence. A silence so thick it pressed down on me like a weight. The figure didn't move. It just stood there, watching me, waiting. I don't know how long I stood there, frozen in place, but eventually, I turned and ran. I ran until my legs burned and my lungs felt like they were going to burst. I didn't stop until I reached the trailhead where my car was parked. When I finally looked back, the figure was gone. I never told anyone what happened in the San Juan National Forest. Not really. I tried to explain it to myself 1,000 different ways. Exhaustion, anxiety, maybe even altitude sickness. But none of that explains the whispers, or the whistling, or the figure that watched me from the trees. I haven't been camping since. The fog was thicker than I'd expected. I pulled my RV into a secluded clearing in Pisgah National Forest and stepped out into the damp air, the smell of wet earth heavy in my nose. Everything was muffled, as though the forest was holding its breath. The trees were shrouded in mist, their trunks fading into the gloom, and the trail I had heard so much about was hidden somewhere out there, waiting for me. I'd come here to find something unique. My vlog had been stagnating, and I needed a fresh angle. A fellow hiker had mentioned an unmarked trail, a path that didn't appear on any maps, one that locals said disappeared and reappeared as though it had a life of its own. Perfect. If I could document it and film the mystery, my audience would eat it up. I grabbed my camera and set it up, filming a quick introduction. Hey everyone, it's Nate here, and I'm in the middle of the misty Pisgah National Forest, about to track down the infamous Vanishing Trail. Legend says this path comes and goes, and people who wander too far down it don't come back. Let's see if that's true. I packed up my gear and set off into the fog. The forest was silent, the only sound my boots crunching on the damp leaves. I had a GPS in my pocket, just in case, but I didn't plan to use it unless things got really bad. I wanted to go off the grid, find this mysterious trail, and see if there was anything to the rumors. I'd always been a skeptic. Ghost stories and folklore were fun to tell around a campfire, but not much else. As I walked, the fog thickened, swallowing the trees. It clung to my skin, cold and heavy. It wasn't long before I found the first strange marker, a stone slab jutting from the ground, its surface covered in symbols, strange spiraling shapes that didn't look like any language I knew. I filmed it, talking into the camera as I described the find. This looks like something from an old burial ground, but there's no mention of this on any maps. Really makes you wonder what else is out here, hidden beneath the fog. I kept moving, the trees closing in tighter. The trail I was following became fainter, more overgrown, and soon it was little more than a game trail, barely wide enough to follow. I pushed forward, keeping my camera rolling. But after another hour of hiking, the trail simply disappeared. One moment, there had been a clear path, and now it was gone, swallowed by the forest. The mist curled around the trees, thick and almost suffocating. But I was certain I'd been on the right trail. I checked my GPS, but the signal flickered weakly. The screen showed that I was in the middle of nowhere. No path, no landmarks, just a blank screen with a blinking dot. Me, standing alone in the fog. Okay, I muttered. You've dealt with worse. I turned back the way I'd come, but the forest looked different now. The trees seemed closer together, the undergrowth denser. The fog was disorienting, and I had to rely on instinct to retrace my steps. The GPS was useless. I kept walking, scanning the ground for signs of the trail, but there was nothing. I was starting to feel uneasy. That's when I heard it. Footsteps, not mine. I froze, listening. The sound came from deeper in the forest, slow, deliberate footsteps crunching on the leaves. I turned, scanning the fog, but there was nothing, just the swirling mist. Then, out of the gloom, a figure emerged, an older man, his clothes tattered and damp, his eyes wide and vacant. Hey, I called, my voice echoing through the stillness. You lost too? The man looked at me for a moment, then shuffled forward. He seemed off. His clothes were torn, his face pale, and there was a distant look in his eyes, like he wasn't entirely there. I've been walking for days, he said, his voice hoarse. The trail? It keeps changing. Are you okay? I asked, stepping toward him. He shook his head. No one's okay out here. I frowned, feeling a cold knot of fear tighten in my stomach. What do you mean? The trail, it moves. I've seen it, watched it disappear and reappear. It's not just a path. It's the forest. It doesn't want us to leave. I stared at him, my mind racing. This guy was either delirious or onto something. Either way, I didn't like the way he was talking. "Look," I said, pulling out my GPS. "We can find our way back." The man glanced at the GPS, then back at me. "It won't help. The forest is messing with it." I didn't believe him. I couldn't. I was a rational guy, and this was just a forest. I'd get us back to my RV, get him some help, and be done with it. But as we walked, things got stranger. The mist thickened, wrapping around the trees like a living thing. The forest seemed to shift with every step. What had been an open path a moment ago was now choked with brambles. When I looked back, the trees seemed to loom closer, twisting into unfamiliar shapes. The man, whose name I learned was Eli, grew more agitated with every passing minute. "It's watching us," he muttered. "It knows we're here." "Who's watching?" I asked, growing impatient. "The forest," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "It's alive, and it's been here long before we were." I ignored him, focusing on the GPS, but even that was failing me. The screen flickered, the signal cutting in and out. At one point, it showed me standing on a clear path, but when I looked up, there was nothing but trees. Thick, twisted trees that looked like they had grown there for centuries. We kept walking, the fog growing thicker, pressing in on us. The air felt heavy, almost suffocating, and then the whispers started. Faint at first, like the wind through the leaves, but then more distinct voices calling out from the mist. "Nate?" I froze, my heart hammering in my chest. "Did you hear that?" I asked. Eli nodded, his eyes wide. "It's calling us, the forest." I tried to shake it off, tell myself it was just the wind, but deep down I knew that wasn't true. The voice had spoken my name. We came across a backpack tangled in the branches of a tree, high above our heads. It was old, covered in dirt and torn, but when I climbed up to retrieve it, I found fresh supplies inside, water, food, like someone had packed it yesterday. I felt a chill run down my spine. How had it gotten there? Eli was growing more paranoid, his eyes darting around as though he expected the trees to come alive at any moment. "We need to leave," he kept saying, "before it's too late." We pushed forward, but no matter which direction we went, we ended up back where we started. The fog seemed to pulse with an unnatural energy, the whispers growing louder. Then, without warning, Eli was gone. I turned around, and he was just gone. The forest had swallowed him whole without a sound. I called out his name, but there was no response, only the dense mist pressing in on me. Panic set in. I was alone, lost in a forest that didn't want me to leave. The GPS was useless, and my camera was flickering, showing distorted footage of things I hadn't seen. Shadows moving in the trees, figures lurking just out of sight. I started running, my breath coming in sharp gasps. The trees twisted and shifted around me, the fog so thick I couldn't see more than a few feet ahead. Every time I thought I'd found a way out, the forest closed in, trapping me in a maze of branches and brambles. The whispers were louder now, calling my name over and over. My camera caught glimpses of movement, dark figures moving through the mist, vanishing before I could focus on them. I didn't know what was real anymore. The forest seemed to warp around me, bending reality to its will. Then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the fog broke. I stumbled out of the trees and found myself back at my RV. The mist lingered at the edge of the forest, but it didn't follow. I didn't wait. I grabbed my keys, threw my gear into the RV, and drove off, my hands shaking on the wheel. I didn't stop until I was miles away, the forest a distant memory in the rearview mirror. Back home, I reviewed the footage. I expected to see the horror I'd witnessed, the proof of the vanishing trail and the strange shifting forest. But the videos showed nothing. The trail looked normal. The mist wasn't as thick, and Eli wasn't in the footage at all. It was like he'd never existed. I tried to tell myself it had been a bad trip, that my mind had played tricks on me, but deep down, I knew the truth. The forest had let me leave, but it hadn't forgotten me, and I had a feeling it was waiting, somewhere in the mist for me to return. I wasn't supposed to be here. Not really. Not in this forest. Not sitting in this RV, staring at the tall trees outside, wondering if this trip would be my last. G. Ford Pino National Forest had been Karen's idea, years ago. She had this way of looking at the world, seeing the beauty in everything. She wanted to camp here, hike the trails, soak in the stillness of the ancient trees. I didn't get it then. Too caught up in work, too busy to care. But now, it was all I had left. It had been a year since she died, and I still couldn't make sense of it. A car accident on a quiet street. Just like that, she was gone. And I was left stumbling through life, trying to figure out how to exist without her. This trip was my last attempt at finding something, anything, that made sense. So here I was, parked deep in the middle of nowhere, hoping that the forest would somehow offer answers. I didn't know what else to do. The trees stretched up into the sky, their thick trunks casting shadows that lingered even in the daylight. It was beautiful in a way, but it felt empty without her. I could almost hear her voice telling me to look at the wildflowers or marvel at the way the sunlight filtered through the branches. I stepped out of the RV. The cool, damp air wrapped around me. The scent of pine and moss was thick, earthy. Everything seemed so alive, and yet all I could feel was the weight of the past pressing down on me. I started a small fire, just like I'd done the past few nights, and sat there watching the flames dance. The crackling wood was the only sound in the stillness. That's when I heard it. Footsteps. They were faint, barely audible over the fire, but distinct enough to make me stand up, heart pounding in my chest. I looked around, scanning the tree line, but saw nothing. Just shadows. I told myself it was probably a deer, or maybe some other animal, but the feeling stuck, the sense that someone was watching me. I wasn't alone. I sat back down, trying to shake the unease, but it lingered. I couldn't stop thinking about the old man I'd met the day before. Edgar. He'd been wandering the campground when I arrived, his wrinkled face covered in a scruffy beard, eyes sharp despite his age. He was friendly enough, but there had been something off about him. "You came at the wrong time," he'd said, staring at me with a knowing look. "Why is that?" I'd asked, brushing it off. Some things shouldn't be disturbed, especially at night. The forest, it has its secrets. I didn't know what to say to that, so I didn't respond. But his words stuck with me, replaying in my mind as I sat by the fire. What did he mean by secrets? What was he talking about? I hadn't thought much of it at the time, but now, sitting in the dark with the fire flickering low, I couldn't shake the feeling that there was something more to what he'd said. The wind picked up, making the trees sway, their branches creaking overhead. The fire sputtered as the breeze caught it, and I stood up again, feeling restless. I needed to move, to walk, anything to clear my head. I grabbed my flashlight and headed into the forest, just far enough to feel like I was doing something. The beam of light cut through the darkness, illuminating the trunks of the trees, but casting long shadows everywhere else. My footsteps were the only sound now, crunching softly on the forest floor. I don't know how far I walked before I saw the first symbol. It was carved into the bark of a tree, a spiral-like shape that looked old, weathered by time. I crouched down, running my fingers over it. It was smooth, unnaturally so, like it had been carved recently. I stood up, shining the light around, and spotted more symbols carved into the trees at odd intervals. Spirals, faces, shapes that made no sense. They all seemed to be pointing deeper into the forest, like a trail leading me somewhere. A chill ran down my spine. I turned back, trying to ignore the nagging curiosity that pulled at me. I wasn't here to chase after strange carvings. I was here to, well, I didn't know why I was here anymore, but this wasn't it. As I made my way back toward the RV, the air seemed heavier, colder. I couldn't hear the wind anymore, and the shadows seemed darker. The feeling that I was being watched returned, stronger this time, like someone or something was following me. My pulse quickened, and I picked up the pace, glancing over my shoulder every few steps. Nothing, just trees and shadows. When I reached the RV, I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. The fire had gone out, leaving nothing but smoldering embers. I climbed inside, locked the door behind me, and sat on the edge of the bed, heart still racing. I was just tired. That's all it was. The grief, the isolation, it was messing with my head. I hadn't been sleeping well, and the loneliness had a way of playing tricks on the mind. At least that's what I told myself. The next morning, I met Leah. She was hiking near the campground, a pack slung over her shoulders, looking every bit the confident outdoorswoman. She was friendly, outgoing, and struck up a conversation with me as soon as we crossed paths. "You camping out here alone?" she asked, her voice light, casual. I nodded. "Yeah, needed some time away, I guess." "I get that," she said, smiling. "This place is something else. It's beautiful, but it can get a little weird at night, don't you think?" I paused, remembering the footsteps, the carvings, Edgar's warnings. "Weird?" I asked. "How strange it can feel out here after dark." "Just stories, old legends. You know how it is with places like this. Every forest has its ghost stories." I tried to keep my tone neutral, but the unease from the night before still lingered. She smiled again, but this time, there was something in her eyes, like she knew more than she was letting on. "Just be careful. It's easy to get lost out here," she said. With that, she waved and continued down the trail, disappearing into the trees. I watched her go, wondering if I should have said more, asked her what she meant, but I didn't. I spent the rest of the day at camp, trying to relax, but the sense of unease only grew stronger. That night, as I sat by the fire again, I couldn't stop thinking about the symbols. They'd seemed so deliberate, so purposeful, like someone or something was trying to lead me deeper into the woods. And then the footsteps returned. This time, they were louder, closer. I stood up, shining my flashlight toward the trees, but saw nothing, just shadows. But the footsteps didn't stop. They circled the RV, slow, deliberate, crunching on the forest floor. My throat tightened as I strained to listen, my heart hammering in my chest. "Who's there?" I called out, but the footsteps didn't answer. Instead, they stopped. Dead silence. I backed toward the RV, fumbling for the door when I saw it. Movement just at the edge of the trees, a figure, tall, thin, barely visible in the darkness. I blinked, and it was gone. I bolted inside, slamming the door behind me, my breath coming in short gasps. What the hell was happening? I sat there for hours, staring at the door, waiting for something to happen, but nothing did. The next morning, Leah was gone. Her tent was still there, her pack sitting neatly outside, but she was nowhere to be found. I searched the area, calling her name, but the forest was silent. It didn't make sense. People didn't just vanish like that, not without a trace. I thought about Edgar, about the stories he'd told, the forgotten one, he'd called it. A legend about a man who'd wandered too far into the forest, losing himself until he became part of the land itself. Now, they said he lured others to join him, preying on their grief, their loneliness, until they disappeared too. I didn't believe it. I couldn't. But Leah was gone, and the symbols were still there, etched into the trees like a warning or an invitation. The footsteps returned that night, and this time, I knew what they wanted. I could hear her voice, Karen's voice, calling to me from the trees, soft, loving, like she was right there, waiting for me. "Derek," she whispered, "come find me." My heart ached, torn between the impossible and the undeniable. I knew it wasn't real. I knew it, but I wanted to believe it was. I stepped outside. The cold air bit at my skin. The forest was dark, silent, but the voice was there, guiding me. I walked toward the trees, my feet moving on their own, drawn by the sound of her voice. "Derek," she called again. "Don't leave me." I stopped at the edge of the woods, staring into the darkness. I could see her now just beyond the first row of trees, her face, her smile. She was there, waiting for me. But something was wrong. The shadows around her shifted, twisting like they were alive. Her eyes, once warm and familiar, were hollow, empty. I took a step back, the spell breaking. This wasn't Karen. I turned and ran back to the RV, back to safety. The forest seemed to close in around me, the trees pressing in as the voice grew louder, angrier. "Derek!" I slammed the door behind me, heart pounding, breath coming in ragged gasps. I could still hear her screaming my name from the trees, but I didn't go back. I couldn't. I left Ford Pinot the next morning, the RV's engine sputtering to life as I drove away. I didn't look back. I didn't need to. The forest had its secrets. I wasn't meant to know them. And whatever it was out there, whatever the forgotten one truly was, it would stay there, waiting for someone else. I thought the desert would heal me. Red Rock Canyon was supposed to be a place to clear my head, to sit in silence and let the vast empty land take away the chaos of the last few months. I'd lost everything: my wife, my job, and I needed something, anything, to remind me there was still some peace left in the world. Instead, it felt like I'd driven into a nightmare. I parked the RV at the far end of the campground, as far away from the few other campers as I could get. I wanted solitude, to think, or maybe to stop thinking. I wasn't sure. The sun was setting as I stepped out, casting a deep orange glow across the red sandstone cliffs. It was beautiful, the kind of beauty that made you feel small, like the world was too big for you to matter. Maybe that's what I needed. I'd been driving for hours, with only the occasional crackle of the radio for company. The RV was old, creaking and groaning as I navigated the winding roads into the canyon. It had seen better days, much like me. As I stretched, a low rumble came from under the hood. "Great," I muttered, giving the RV a half-hearted kick. The engine had been acting up for days, but I figured I could deal with it later. I wasn't here for that. I was here to get away, to let the emptiness of the desert swallow me whole. That night, after I'd settled in, I sat outside the RV, staring up at the stars. Out here, away from the city, the sky was incredible, clear, endless. But as the stars twinkled overhead, I noticed something strange. At first, I thought they were planes, blinking in and out far above the canyon. But then they moved too fast, too erratically. I leaned forward, squinting. There were 3 of them, glowing faintly blue, darting through the sky in impossible patterns. They weren't planes. I wasn't sure what they were. I stood up, straining my neck to follow their path as they circled overhead. They blinked off one by one, and the desert was silent again. Just stars, I told myself, even though I knew it wasn't true. The next morning, I woke up to find the RV's battery almost dead. My phone, which I'd left charging overnight, hadn't gained a single bar. I tried turning the engine over, but all I got was a dull click. My chest tightened. Being stranded in the middle of the desert wasn't part of the plan. I had enough food and water for a few days, sure, but the isolation was starting to feel less like a retreat and more like a trap. Milo's RV was parked a few spots down, his beat-up RV sitting in the shade of a large rock formation. He waved me over as I stepped out of mine, a wide grin on his sunburnt face. "Morning," he called. "Beautiful day, huh?" I forced a smile. "Yeah, sure. Hey, you wouldn't happen to have jumper cables, would you?" Milo scratched his scruffy chin, then shook his head. "Sorry, friend, but I can give you a ride into town later if you need help. It's not too far." I thanked him, but something about Milo unsettled me. Maybe it was how relaxed he seemed, like this place wasn't bothering him at all. As I stood there, he tilted his head toward the canyon walls. "You see the lights last night?" he asked. I froze. "Yeah, what were they?" He shrugged, like it was nothing. "Oh, those things. People talk about them all the time. Could be military. Could be something else. No one really knows, but they've been around as long as I've been camping out here." I laughed nervously. "Something else, huh?" Milo smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "People say they're not from this world. I don't know about that, but sometimes they follow you. Just don't go too far out at night, and you'll be fine." I forced another laugh, but my stomach churned. Milo's tone was too casual, too accepting. I thanked him again, and went back to my RV, trying to shake off the feeling that I was missing something important. The day dragged on, the heat baking the ground beneath my feet. I spent the afternoon hiking a short trail near the campground, trying to clear my head, but the vast emptiness only made me feel more alone. I kept thinking about the lights, about how they'd moved, how they seemed to watch me. That night, they returned. I was sitting outside again, nursing a warm beer and staring at the sky when I saw them, 3 faint blue lights hovering over the canyon. This time, they were closer, too close. They flickered almost playfully, darting back and forth like they were searching for something. I stood up, my heart pounding. It didn't make sense. Nothing about this place made sense. I backed toward the RV, never taking my eyes off the lights, but as I reached for the door, the lights blinked out. Gone, just like that. A cold breeze swept through the canyon, and I shivered. It was too quiet, No wind, no insects, nothing. Just the dead, suffocating silence of the desert. Then the RV lights flickered once, twice, and went dark. My chest tightened as I stumbled into the RV, fumbling for the flashlight. I clicked it on, but the beam was weak, barely cutting through the darkness. The electrical panel was dead, and my phone wouldn't turn on. Every piece of technology I had was failing, and I had no idea why. A sudden knock on the door made me jump. "Chris, you okay?" It was Emily, the hiker I'd met earlier that day. She'd pitched her tent nearby, planning to stay for a few nights before heading out. I opened the door, trying to hide my panic. "Yeah, just some electrical issues," I said, forcing a smile. "Everything's dead. I'm guessing the battery's shot." Emily frowned, glancing back at her tent. "That's weird. My phone's dead too, and my flashlight keeps flickering." Her voice was calm, but I could see the worry in her eyes. She felt it too, the strangeness in the air, the weight of the silence. She stepped closer, her voice dropping to a whisper. "Do you think it's the lights? Milo told me about them earlier, said people disappear sometimes." I swallowed hard, trying to keep my breathing steady. "Disappear?" Emily nodded, her gaze drifting toward the canyon. "Yeah, it's mostly stories, but you seemed pretty convinced." For a moment, neither of us spoke. The air felt thick, heavy, like the desert was closing in on us. I wasn't sure if I believed in Milo's campfire tales, but the lights, they were real, and they weren't natural. "We should get out of here," Emily said, breaking the silence. "I don't like this." "I can't," I replied. "My RV won't start." She hesitated, then nodded. "Mine either. I tried earlier, but it's completely dead." We stood there, staring at each other, the weight of the situation sinking in. Something was wrong with this place. The lights weren't just an oddity. They were doing something, affecting everything around us, and we were stuck miles from any help. "We'll wait till morning," I said, trying to sound confident. "Maybe it's just a temporary glitch. We'll figure it out." Emily didn't look convinced, but she nodded and headed back to her tent. I locked the RV door behind her, though I wasn't sure what good it would do. That night, I barely slept. The silence was oppressive, like a blanket wrapped too tight around me. Every creak of the RV, every gust of wind made my heart race. I kept waiting for the lights to come back, to hover outside my window, but they didn't. Instead, I woke up sometime in the early hours. Drenched in sweat, my head pounding. I sat up, blinking in the darkness. Something was wrong. I glanced at my watch. It was 4 a.m., but that didn't make sense. I'd checked the time just moments ago, and it had been midnight. Where had the hours gone? I stumbled outside, feeling disoriented. The air was cooler now, the desert's chill settling in. The stars were out, but there was no sign of the lights. My mind was foggy, like I'd been dreaming. But the dust on my boots told me I'd been walking. But where? And why? Panic surged through me. I couldn't remember. Hours were missing, and I had no idea what had happened. The lights were playing with us, toying with our sense of reality. I ran toward Emily's tent, calling her name, but when I got there, she was gone. Her tent was empty, her pack still there, but she was nowhere to be found. "Emily!" I shouted, my voice echoing off the canyon walls. Nothing. The only sound was the wind. I backed away, my heart hammering in my chest. This wasn't real. It couldn't be. But the lights, the missing time, it all pointed to one terrifying conclusion. We weren't alone. I sprinted back to my RV, slamming the door behind me, and tried the engine again. To my shock, it roared to life. The headlights flickered on, and I didn't hesitate. I jammed the gear shift into drive and tore out of the campsite, gravel kicking up behind me as I sped down the winding canyon road. I glanced in the rearview mirror for just a second. I saw them, the blue lights hovering in the distance, watching me leave. I didn't stop driving until I hit the outskirts of Las Vegas. The neon lights of the city felt like a lifeline. But even then, as I pulled into a gas station, my hands shaking, I couldn't shake the feeling that the lights were still out there, waiting. And I wasn't sure if I'd really escaped at all. "6 months in the Smokies. 6 months. 6 whole months without touching a drop. I should have been proud, right? But sitting alone in this RV, deep in the Great Smoky Mountains, I didn't feel proud. I felt restless, empty, even the kind of empty that creeps up on you, settling in your bones when there's nothing but the sound of your own thoughts bouncing around your skull. This trip was supposed to be a celebration, a gift to myself for staying clean. I thought the solitude would help me clear my head, maybe give me some perspective. The Smokies had always been a place of peace for me. My dad used to take me camping here when I was a kid, back when life was simple, before the bottle got its hooks into me. I pulled out my phone, flicking through pictures of those old trips. My thumb hesitated over the last photo of my dad and me standing by a roaring campfire. That was before everything went to hell, before the drinking became my escape from everything I couldn't face. The phone buzzed, pulling me back to the present. It was my brother Jake, checking in as usual. "Hey man," he said when I answered. "How's the trip? You hanging in there?" Jake was always the responsible one, clean-cut, married with kids, a steady job. He'd been my lifeline after the wreckage of my addiction. I owed him more than I could ever repay. "Yeah, it's good," I lied. "Just me and the trees? Peaceful." "You staying out of trouble?" I chuckled. "I'm not exactly near any temptations out here," I said. I didn't tell him about the bottle I'd brought with me. It sat in the back of the RV, unopened, but still there, just in case. A cruel comfort. I'd stared at it more than once already, the amber liquid calling to me in the quiet. "Good to hear," Jake said, though I could hear the doubt in his voice. "Just keep your head straight, all right? I know it's tough being out there alone, but you got this. Call me if you need anything." "I will. Thanks." I ended the call and tossed the phone onto the bed. The sun was setting outside, casting long shadows through the trees. The sky faded from a soft orange to deep purple, and with it, the familiar sense of isolation began to settle in. The first night in the Smokies should have been serene, but as soon as the darkness took over, I felt it, the unease. The forest around me was too quiet. It was like it was holding its breath. No wind, no rustling leaves, just the faint crackle of my campfire outside. I sat at the picnic table near the fire, trying to relax, but the silence only seemed to grow heavier. I poked at the flames with a stick, hoping they'd somehow keep the stillness at bay. Then I heard it. A whistle. Faint at first, like a breeze cutting through the trees, but unmistakably human. I froze, listening. It was tuneless, just a single drawn-out note that seemed to float through the air. I scanned the tree line, but there was nothing. No movement. No one else was supposed to be this far out. I'd parked in a secluded area of the park, away from the main trails. The whistling continued, soft but constant. "Probably just the wind," I muttered to myself. But even as I said it, I knew that wasn't true. It didn't sound like wind. It sounded deliberate. I stood, the hairs on the back of my neck prickling, and slowly circled the fire. I kept the flames between me and the trees, my eyes darting between the dark shapes of the pines. The whistle came again, louder this time, closer. My heart hammered in my chest, the familiar anxiety clawing its way up my throat. "Who's there?" I called, my voice breaking the thick silence. No response, just another long, drawn-out whistle. I grabbed my flashlight from the RV and swept the beam through the trees. The light cut through the darkness, but all I saw were shadows. No footsteps, no crunch of leaves, just that damn whistling drifting through the trees like a ghost. I didn't sleep much that night. The next day, I tried to convince myself it was nothing. It had to be nothing, right? Just a trick of the wind. The mountains could be strange like that, especially at night. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. The bottle of whiskey in the back of the RV started to look more and more appealing, but I shoved that thought down. I wasn't here for that. Not this time. To clear my head, I went for a hike, following a trail that wound through the dense forest. The air was crisp, the smell of pine and damp earth filling my lungs. For a while it worked. I could almost forget about the night before. Almost. That's when I saw the first marking. It was carved into the bark of a tree, a rough, jagged symbol that looked like a spiral or maybe an eye. I couldn't tell. It didn't look natural, though. It felt intentional, like a warning. I ran my fingers over it, the grooves deep and uneven. I kept walking, but the further I went, the more of the symbols I saw. Spirals, faces, strange runes carved into trees, all leading deeper into the woods. It felt like they were guiding me somewhere, though I wasn't sure I wanted to find out where. That night, the whistling returned. I was sitting by the fire again, trying to keep my mind off the bottle, when the sound came drifting through the trees. This time, it wasn't soft. It was louder, closer. I stood up, flashlight in hand, and scanned the forest. My heart pounded in my ears. My mouth went dry. The whistling seemed to circle the campsite, moving slowly but deliberately. It was all I could hear, filling the silence like a haunting lullaby. I turned, and that's when I saw him. Standing just beyond the tree line was a figure. A man, gaunt and pale, his hollow eyes fixed on me. He stood motionless, his lips pursed as he whistled that same eerie, tuneless note. "Hey!" I called, my voice cracking. "What do you want?" The figure didn't respond. He just stood there, watching me. The whistling grew louder, more insistent, cutting through the night air like a knife. I took a step toward him, but as soon as I moved, he turned and disappeared into the trees. My hands were shaking. I wasn't sure if it was fear or something else, something deeper. I felt the urge to chase him, to follow that haunting sound, but my legs refused to move. I stayed by the fire until dawn, too scared to go back inside the RV. The next day, I tried to leave. I packed up my gear, grabbed the keys to the RV, and decided I'd had enough of the Smokies. But when I tried to start the engine, it wouldn't turn over. Just a dull click. I swore under my breath, popped the hood, and checked the battery. Everything looked fine, but the damn thing wouldn't start. I tried calling Jake, but my phone was dead. I'd charged it the night before, but now it was completely drained. No signal, no service, nothing. The forest around me felt suffocating. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me, waiting just beyond the trees. The whistling started again, faint at first, then growing louder, like a taunting melody. I grabbed the bottle from the back of the RV. I wasn't going to drink it, not yet. But holding it made me feel better, more in control, as if I could use it as a weapon somehow. That night, the stranger came back. I woke up to the sound of whistling, loud, sharp, right outside the RV. I sat up, heart pounding, and looked out the window. He was standing by the fire pit, his pale face illuminated by the flames. His eyes were fixed on me, unblinking, and that awful whistling filled the air, pressing in on me from all sides. He took a step toward the RV, and I felt the panic rise in my chest. I grabbed the bottle, holding it like a club, and stumbled outside. The air was freezing, my breath coming in ragged gasps. The whistling pierced through my skull, making it hard to think. I raised the bottle, ready to throw it. But then something stopped me. For the first time in days, I heard something else. A voice, faint but real. Jake's voice. "Nick, don't do it." I blinked, shaking my head. The stranger was gone. The whistling had stopped, and there in the silence, I realized what I had been about to do. The bottle slipped from my hands and shattered on the ground. I dropped to my knees, gasping for air, the weight of everything crashing down on me. The whistling was gone, but the fear, the isolation, it wasn't something I could run from. Not out here. Not anywhere. When the sun rose, I tried the RV again. This time, it started. I drove out of the Smokies that morning, not looking back. The whistling stayed behind, lost in the trees, but the memory of it, the temptation would stay with me. 6 months sober. But this trip taught me something I hadn't been ready to face. Some demons don't live in bottles. They live in the silence, in the spaces we create for ourselves when we're trying to hide from the world. I hadn't planned on staying at Stillwater Grove. The campground wasn't even marked on my map, just a small patch of green near the edge of Shawnee National Forest. But as I drove down the empty forest road, I saw the sign. Old, weathered wood with the words Stillwater Grove Campground carved into it. It felt like an invitation, one I couldn't resist. I'd been on the road for weeks, photographing wildlife for a personal project I'd picked up after quitting my job. The last few months had been a blur of long drives, lonely campsites, and an overwhelming need to be anywhere but back in the city. I didn't miss my corporate job or my ex. What I did miss was the feeling that I knew what the hell I was doing with my life. Stillwater Grove seemed perfect, quiet, isolated, and right by the lake. It would give me the break I needed, some peace before heading back into the real world. When I pulled into the campsite, the late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the grove. The air was still, the only sound being the gentle lapping of water against the shore. A single RV sat on the far side of the campground, a distant figure moving near it. Otherwise, it was just me. I parked my RV near the edge of the lake, the water glistening under the fading light. After setting up camp, I grabbed my camera and headed toward the shore, hoping to catch the sunset. As I stood there, framing the perfect shot, a voice startled me. "Beautiful, isn't it?" I turned to see a woman standing a few feet away, her face half in shadow. She had an otherworldly kind of beauty, pale skin, long dark hair, and eyes that seemed to take in everything. "Yeah," I replied, lowering my camera. "It's peaceful." She smiled. "It always is here. I'm Ellie, by the way." "Nick," I said, shaking her outstretched hand. Her skin was cold, like she'd been standing in the shade for too long. "You camping here too?" "For a little while," she said, her voice soft. "I come here every now and then. Can't stay away." Her words sent a shiver down my spine, though I couldn't explain why. I wasn't used to talking to people much anymore. The solitude had become my comfort zone, and something about Ellie felt out of place. "You here for the fishing?" I asked, trying to make small talk. She shook her head. "No, just the lake, the quiet." We stood in silence for a moment, watching the sun sink behind the trees. The sky turned shades of pink and orange, the water reflecting the colors like a mirror. I raised my camera, snapping a few shots, and when I looked back, Ellie was gone, just like that. I glanced around, but there was no sign of her. The other RV was still parked at the far end of the grove, but there was no movement. I chalked it up to her being quick on her feet, though it left me feeling oddly unsettled. That night, I couldn't sleep. The wind had picked up, making the trees outside rustle against each other like whispered secrets. I rolled over in bed, trying to find a comfortable position, but something felt off. The RV was too cold, colder than it should have been. I checked the thermostat, but everything seemed normal. Still, the chill lingered. I grabbed a blanket and tried to force myself to sleep. That's when I heard it. A faint sound, barely audible at first, like a woman's voice carried on the wind. I sat up, listening, but it was gone. Just my imagination, I thought. Long days alone in the woods will do that to you. But then I heard it again. This time it was clearer, a soft, melodic humming coming from outside. I climbed out of bed, grabbing my flashlight. My breath fogged up in the cold air as I stepped outside the RV, scanning the campsite. Nothing. Just the stillness of the lake and the trees swaying gently in the wind. But the humming persisted, coming from near the water's edge. I walked toward the shore, the beam of my flashlight dancing over the ground. And that's when I saw her. A woman in white, standing at the edge of the lake, her back to me. Her long, dark hair hung loose down her back, swaying slightly as she hummed that haunting tune. "Ellie?" I called out, my voice shaking. She didn't turn. She just stood there, motionless, her gaze fixed on the water. Something about the way she stood, so still, so rigid, set my nerves on edge. I took a step closer, the flashlight illuminating her pale figure. But as soon as the light touched her, she vanished. I blinked, stunned. 1 second, she'd been there. And the next, she was gone. The water rippled where she had been standing, but otherwise, the lake was empty. I backed away, my heart pounding in my chest. What the hell was that? I hurried back to the RV, locking the door behind me. My breath came in quick, shallow gasps. My hands were shaking. I didn't believe in ghosts or supernatural nonsense, but what I'd seen, it wasn't right. I had seen her. I knew I had. I spent the rest of the night wide awake, staring at the ceiling, and trying to rationalize what had happened. But no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't shake the image of that woman standing by the lake. The next morning, I found Ellie near the grove, sitting by a small campfire. She smiled when she saw me, though her smile didn't quite reach her eyes. "Rough night?" she asked, as if she already knew. "Yeah," I said, sitting down across from her. "I saw something last night. A woman by the lake. I thought it was you, but she wasn't there when you got close. Ellie finished, her voice calm, too calm. The Lady of Stillwater. The what? I asked, feeling a chill run through me. Ellie looked at me, her eyes dark and hollow. She's been here for a long time. Longer than the campground, longer than the trees. She drowned in the lake, or so the story goes. Some say she was waiting for someone. Her lover, I think, but he never showed. I stared at her, my stomach twisting. You're telling me she's a ghost? Ellie shrugged. Call it what you want, but she's real, and now that you've seen her, she won't let you go. I laughed, though it came out shaky. That's insane. Is it? Ellie asked, her gaze locking onto mine. You saw her. You know she's real. I opened my mouth to argue, but the words died in my throat. I had seen her, and it hadn't been a trick of the light or my imagination. Something had been there, something that shouldn't have been. What does she want? I asked quietly. Ellie's eyes flicked toward the lake. She wants what she's always wanted, to take someone with her into the water. That night, the sound started again. At first, it was the soft humming, drifting through the night air. Then the splashing, gentle, rhythmic, like someone wading through the water. I lay in bed, my heart racing, my body tense. I didn't want to go outside. I didn't want to see her again. But the pull was stronger this time. A strange compulsion tugged at me, drawing me toward the lake. I tried to fight it, to stay in the RV, but my legs moved on their own, carrying me outside into the cold night air. The lake was calm, reflecting the pale moonlight. And there she was, standing in the water, her white dress billowing around her as if moved by an unseen current. Come to me, she whispered, her voice soft but clear. Please come. I took a step forward, my body moving against my will. The water lapped at my shoes, and I could feel the cold seeping into my skin. Come with me, she said again, her voice almost pleading now. I've waited so long. I fought to resist, to break free from whatever force was drawing me in. But my feet kept moving, the water now up to my knees, freezing cold. I could feel the pull of the lake, the weight of the water dragging me down. Suddenly, a hand grabbed my arm, yanking me back with such force that I stumbled onto the shore. Ellie stood beside me, her face pale, her grip strong. You have to leave, she said, her voice urgent now. Before it's too late. I looked back at the lake, but the woman was gone. The water was still, as if nothing had happened. What the hell is happening? I gasped, my breath coming in shallow bursts. Ellie's expression was grim. She's marked you now. If you stay, she'll take you. You have to go. I didn't argue. I packed up my things, my hands shaking, adrenaline coursing through my veins. Within minutes, I was back in the RV, starting the engine and pulling out of the campsite as fast as I could. As I drove away, I glanced in the rearview mirror. Ellie stood at the edge of the grove, watching me go, her face unreadable. And behind her, just barely visible in the mist, was the Lady of Stillwater, her pale eyes following me, waiting for me to return. I didn't look back again. My name's Brian Patel, and this happened to me in the National Forest in Oregon. I grew up in Portland and spent most weekends hiking the trails with my dad. After he passed away, I kept the tradition alive, even though the solitude wasn't quite the same. I wasn't the sentimental type, but being out there brought some quiet to my otherwise loud, chaotic life as an electrician. That particular weekend, and I'd planned a 2-day solo trek, something to clear my head and test out some new gear. I wasn't an ultralight fanatic or anything, but I liked keeping things minimal. Just me, the trail, and whatever nature threw at me. My route started at Timberline Lodge and cut through some backcountry trails that didn't see much traffic. It was early morning when I set out, a thermos of black coffee in one hand and a map in the other. The first few hours were uneventful. The trails were damp from rain earlier in the week, and the scent of pine mixed with the occasional waft of mushrooms kept things pleasant. Around noon, I passed an older couple hiking with trekking poles. They waved but didn't stop to chat, which was fine by me. Solitude was the point. It was late afternoon when I noticed the first odd thing. I'd stopped at a clearing to refill my water from a nearby creek. The silence was too perfect. No birds, no rustling. Nothing. It wasn't unusual for animals to scatter when a human came stomping through, but this was eerie, like the forest was holding its breath. I joked to myself that maybe I'd finally reached that perfect peace people were always yapping about in self-help books. As I climbed higher into the denser part of the forest, the feeling lingered. Every so often, I'd hear a snapping twig or see a flash of movement out of the corner of my eye, but I chalked it up to squirrels or deer. That changed when I reached the ridge. There was a campsite up there, or at least what was left of one. A collapsed tent lay flattened against the dirt, its poles bent at odd angles. Gear was scattered around like someone had emptied a backpack in a panic. What caught my attention was the cooler, one of those sturdy, bear-resistant kinds. Its lid was wrenched open, and deep claw marks gouged the plastic. I didn't recognize the pattern. It didn't look like bear claws. Whatever did it had talons. I poked around cautiously. A jacket with a name tag, Franklin, hung on a low branch, ripped down the middle like someone had tried to peel it off. That's when I saw the blood. Not a lot, but enough to know something had gone wrong. My stomach tightened. I didn't consider myself squeamish, but the combination of the silence and the blood made the air feel heavier, like it was pressing down on me. I didn't linger. I wasn't about to play hero and investigate further, but I also didn't want to turn back the way I'd come. The campsite had a bad vibe, and if someone was injured, I wasn't eager to meet whatever or whoever had caused it. I decided to push forward toward a secondary trailhead about 5 miles out. It wasn't on my original route, but it would get me out of there quicker. The trail narrowed as I descended into a gully. Thick undergrowth swallowed most of the light, and the temperature seemed to drop. My boots squelched in the damp earth as I pushed past ferns that slapped against my legs. About halfway down, I caught a foul odor, like rotting meat mixed with damp fur. My first thought was a dead animal, maybe a cougar kill left to rot, but it was strong enough to make my eyes water. Then I heard it, a low, deep rumbling noise that didn't sound natural. It wasn't a growl, but it wasn't mechanical either. It reverberated through the trees, making it impossible to pinpoint the direction. My fight or flight instincts kicked in, and I chose the third option, freeze. I crouched low, scanning the trees, my heart hammering in my chest. The noise came again, closer this time, followed by the crunch of heavy footsteps. I forced myself to move, creeping forward as quietly as possible. The trail curved ahead, and just as I rounded the bend, I saw it, or at least part of it. A massive, hulking shape loomed through the trees, crouched over something on the ground. Its limbs were grotesquely long, the joints bending in ways that didn't make sense. It had patches of wiry fur mottled with bare, pale skin. What struck me most was its posture, like a predator that had evolved to ambush. I stayed hidden behind a tree, trying not to breathe. Whatever it was feeding, its movements jerky and almost insect-like. The thing was tearing into something unrecognizable, its talons slicing through flesh with surgical precision. My stomach churned, and I fought the urge to retch. The smell was overwhelming. A sudden snap of a branch underfoot betrayed me. The creature's head shot up, swiveling unnaturally as it scanned for the source of the noise. I didn't get a clear view of its face, but I did see its teeth, rows of uneven serrated spikes that looked like they belonged in a shark, not on land. I bolted. Stealth be damned, I sprinted down the trail, branches clawing at my face and arms. The sound of pursuit was immediate, heavy footfalls crashing through the undergrowth. I didn't dare look back. My pack jostled against my shoulders as I weaved through the narrow trail, adrenaline pushing me faster than I thought possible. The trail forked ahead, and I veered left without thinking. Bad move. The path led to a dead end, a sheer drop-off into a ravine. My options were limited. Jump and risk breaking something, or turn and face the thing head-on. Neither seemed appealing. I scrambled up a boulder, hoping to gain some height and buy myself time. The creature burst through the trees moments later, its gangly frame silhouetted against the dim light. Up close, it was worse. Its skin was stretched too tight over its bones, and its movements were unnervingly smooth, like it was gliding rather than walking. It paused, tilting its head as if deciding whether I was worth the effort. I fumbled for the small knife in my pocket, knowing it was more symbolic than anything. The creature lunged forward, and I did the only thing I could. I threw my pack at it. The motion startled it, and it recoiled briefly, giving me enough time to leap down the side of the ravine. I tumbled hard, dirt and rocks tearing at my clothes as I slid to the bottom. My ankle twisted painfully, but I managed to scramble to my feet. The creature didn't follow immediately, but I could hear it pacing above, its claws scraping against the rocks as it searched for another way down. I limped through the ravine, following the trickle of water downstream. My only thought was to keep moving, to put as much distance as possible between me and that thing. The ravine eventually opened up into a clearing, and I spotted a ranger's cabin in the distance. Relief surged through me, though it was tempered by the realization that I wasn't out of the woods yet, literally or figuratively. The cabin was locked, but I found an axe leaning against the woodpile. It wasn't much, but it was better than nothing. I crouched low, gripping the axe and scanning the tree line. Minutes felt like hours as I waited, every rustle of leaves setting my nerves on edge. When it came, it was sudden. The creature barreled into the clearing, moving faster than seemed possible for its lanky frame. I swung the axe as it charged, catching it in the shoulder. The impact staggered it, but the thing didn't go down. It lashed out with its talons, grazing my arm and drawing blood. We circled each other, predator and prey, roles blurring. I swung again, aiming for its head this time. The blade connected with a sickening crunch, and the creature let out a piercing screech. It collapsed, twitching violently before going still. I didn't stick around to admire my handiwork. With my arm bleeding and my ankle screaming in pain, I limped back toward the trailhead, keeping an eye on the shadows. I flagged down the first car I saw, a bewildered couple who probably thought I'd lost my mind. Years later, I avoid Mount Hood. Not because I'm scared, but because I've learned to stick to places where nature follows the rules, or at least pretends to. I'm going to be honest with you. Being a cop in a small town isn't glamorous. It's not like the movies where every day is a shootout or a high-speed chase. It's mostly handling neighbor disputes over where someone's fence ends or someone's dog barking too much. My name's Lucas Giroux, and I've been wearing the badge for 9 years here in Chesterville, Louisiana. Population about 2,000, give or take. I love this town. It's quiet, peaceful for the most part, and I like that. My days are usually filled with mundane tasks, which suits me just fine. I didn't sign up to be some action hero, but that was before what happened in 2014. That night, everything changed. Chesterville sits on the edge of Lake Vere, a slow-moving body of water surrounded by cypress trees and swampland. People here fish, drink, and go about their lives. It was a pretty uneventful Thursday evening. I was sitting in the patrol car near the lake, enjoying the last of my coffee. That's when the call came through. Domestic disturbance, 14 miles out of town, near the edge of the bayou. Some old shack out there. Probably a drunk couple having a fight. I sighed, thinking about how cold my coffee was going to get by the time I got back. I could have ignored the call. In a town this small, people mostly resolve their issues on their own. But it's my job, and I'm not the kind of guy to leave a job half done. So I punched the gas and headed toward the edge of the swamp, the smell of rotting vegetation creeping into the car through the vents. The air always smells different out there. Heavy, like something's growing in the darkness. The address was off the main road. Way off. I had to take a gravel path that was barely wide enough for my cruiser, with branches scraping against the sides like they were trying to keep me from going any further. The place was almost hidden behind thick trees, vines practically choking the building itself. It was an old, decaying wooden structure, more of a cabin than a house. When I stepped out of the car, everything felt wrong. The hair on the back of my neck prickled, but I shook it off. Maybe I was just on edge because it was so quiet. And in a town where quiet usually means safety, this felt different, like something was waiting. I knocked on the door. No answer. I knocked again. louder this time. That's when I heard it, a scraping noise from inside, something heavy being dragged across the floor. I called out, "Chesterville PD, anyone home?" Still nothing. Now, I've dealt with drunks, domestic fights, and all sorts of noise complaints, but the sound coming from inside wasn't something I'd heard before. My hand instinctively went to my gun as I tried the doorknob. Locked. I circled the cabin, looking for another way in, when I noticed something strange, a set of footprints leading around the back. But not human ones. These prints were larger, clawed, like some kind of animal. But whatever made them was walking on two legs, and they were fresh. I was starting to think this wasn't just some domestic dispute. I followed the prints, feeling a chill in the pit of my stomach. As I reached the back of the cabin, I saw the door was ajar, hanging on its hinges. I pulled out my flashlight and stepped inside. The first thing that hit me was the smell, like rotting meat mixed with damp earth. The cabin was small, just one room, with a dirty mattress on the floor and a table covered in old newspapers. But what caught my eye was the blood. It was smeared across the floor, thick and dark, leading to a corner where something was slumped. I shone the flashlight on it. It was a man, or what was left of him. His body had been torn apart, like he'd been mauled by something much bigger than any animal I'd ever seen in these parts. His chest was ripped open, ribs exposed, and his face, well, there wasn't much left to recognize. I barely had time to process the scene when I heard that same dragging noise again, but closer this time, coming from behind me. I turned, heart racing, and shone the light toward the sound. Something was moving in the shadows. Something big. At first I thought it was a bear, but bears don't move like that, and they sure as hell don't stand on two legs. It stepped into the light and I froze. It was tall, maybe 8 feet, with matted fur and a face that looked almost human, but twisted, distorted, like something halfway between a person and a wolf. Its claws were long, too long for anything natural, and its mouth was smeared with blood, teeth glistening like knives. I didn't hesitate. I drew my gun and fired, emptying the magazine into the thing's chest. But it barely flinched. The bullets hit, sure, but they didn't seem to do much more than piss it off. It let out this low sound, like it was irritated more than hurt, and took a step toward me. I backed up, reloading as quickly as I could, my hands shaking. I've never been a great shot, but at this range, it didn't seem to matter. Nothing was going to stop this thing. It lunged. I dove out of the way, crashing into a shelf that sent bottles and cans scattering across the floor. My head was spinning, but I managed to scramble to my feet and run for the door. I don't know how, but I made it back to the car, slamming the door shut just as it slammed into the side of the cruiser, rocking it on its wheels. I threw the car into reverse, tires spinning in the mud as I gunned it back down the gravel path. The thing didn't follow me. It just stood there, in the rearview mirror, watching. As I sped away, its shape slowly faded into the darkness of the swamp. When I finally reached the main road, I stopped, hands gripping the steering wheel so tight my knuckles turned white. I had to call it in. But what the hell was I going to say? That some kind of monster tore a man apart and nearly killed me? I thought about it for a long moment, staring at the radio, before deciding to do something I never thought I'd do. I lied. When I called it in, I said I found the man already dead. Looked like some kind of animal attack. Maybe a bear, maybe a wild dog. Hell, maybe both. I didn't mention the thing I saw. I couldn't. No one would believe me. I barely believed it myself. But here's the thing. I wasn't the only one out there that night. I found out later that 2 fishermen had been on the lake, close enough to the cabin to hear the gunshots. They saw something too. Something large, moving through the trees. They didn't get a good look at it, but they said it wasn't a bear. Wasn't anything they'd ever seen before. And they swore it walked on 2 legs. The next morning, I went back out there with the sheriff and a couple of deputies. We found the body, or what was left of it, but there was no sign of the creature. Just those same strange tracks leading off into the swamp. The sheriff wrote it up as an animal attack, but I could see it in his eyes. He knew something didn't add up. I've thought about that night a lot since then. about how close I came to ending up like that poor bastard in the cabin, and about what's still out there, lurking in the swamp. Some nights, when it's real quiet, I wonder if it's still watching. But I've learned not to go looking for answers. Sometimes, in a place like this, it's better to let the mysteries stay buried.